Saturday morning. My cabin's power just went dark. A woman was standing at my breaker box. Neighbors gathered, whispering, filming on phones. I stayed calm, arms crossed, watching her lie. She smiled the way people smile before losing. 2 patrol cars rolled up the gravel drive. She had no idea whose company she just called the cops on. My name is Emily Carter, 42, and I inherited this cabin from my late husband Tom, the quiet man who built half the power lines running through these hills. I kept our life simple. Nobody up here knew what I actually owned. Blue Ridge Hollow was supposed to be my peace. Pine trees, a creek, a porch swing Tom built with his own hands. I came up most weekends alone now, paid my HOA dues on time, and mostly kept to myself, which some people mistake for weakness. The Hollow's HOA had one true ruler, Deborah Whitfield, who'd run the board for 11 years with a clipboard, a whistle, and an opinion on everyone's mailbox color. People called her Debbie to her face and something else behind her back. Debbie's son Chad had been circling the Hollow for a year, talking about a boutique resort rebrand, buying up cabins one by one from owners who got tired of fighting his mother. He needed mine, and I never would. The first warning came in an email titled Community Standards Reminder, listing my porch swing, my firewood stack, and my unapproved rustic aesthetic as violations. I read it twice, laughed once, and filed it in a folder labeled Debbie. At the spring meeting, Debbie stood at the podium describing a vision of elevated mountain luxury for the Hollow. She glanced at me twice while saying it, like she expected applause. I clapped along with everyone else and said nothing. Afterward, she cornered me by the coffee urn. Chad's offer is very generous, Emily. Cabins like yours won't fit the new direction. I told her my cabin wasn't for sale. Her smile didn't move, but her eyes went cold and calculating. Word got around fast that I turned Chad down. Suddenly my trash bins were left out too long. My gravel driveway was eroding the shared road, and a fine notice appeared in my mailbox for a fence that had stood since 1998. I paid the fine without argument. Fighting Debbie in writing only gave her more paperwork to weaponize. Tom used to say some people can't be reasoned with, only outlasted. I decided to outlast her, one quiet weekend at a time. My neighbor Ruth, 78 and sharp as a tack, warned me over the fence one evening. She ran the Delaney's out in 2 years. Nice folks. She wins or you leave. I nodded and kept stacking firewood. Debbie began showing up unannounced, checking on the property line, clipboard in hand, measuring things that didn't need measuring. She'd linger at my breaker box mounted outside near the shed, tapping it with her pen like she was memorizing something. I didn't think much of it then. I was too focused on the quiet work I actually did during the week. Work that had nothing to do with cabins or clipboards, and everything to do with keeping lights on across 3 counties. What nobody in the Hollow knew, not even Ruth, was that I sat on the board of Ridgeline Power and Light, the utility that fed electricity to this entire mountainside, including the pole standing 30 feet from Debbie Whitfield's own porch. Tom had founded Ridgeline decades ago from a single generator and a promise to string lines to families the big companies wouldn't bother with. When he died, the company came to me, quietly, the way most real things in my life had. I never brought it up at HOA meetings. Money changes how people treat you, and I'd learned that lesson the hard way once already. Up here, I just wanted to be Emily from cabin 14, not the power company lady. Debbie, meanwhile, was building something of her own, a small empire of favors and fear. Board members who crossed her lost their parking permits. Owners who complained got random inspections. Everyone paid their dues to Debbie's HOA, and Debbie paid attention to who obeyed. Chad's resort pitch needed 12 contiguous lots to make the financing work, and he already had 9. My cabin, Ruth's, and the Delaney's old place, now owned by a young couple named the Ortegas, stood squarely in his way. I found out through Ruth that Chad had promised his mother a cut of the development if she could clear the last 3 holdouts before autumn. Suddenly the fines, the emails, the surprise visits made a lot more sense to me. One Tuesday I came up early and found Debbie's SUV already parked near my shed. She was crouched by my breaker box again, this time with a small notebook, sketching something. When she saw me, she stood fast and smiled too wide. "Just documenting infrastructure for the board," she said. I asked which board policy required sketching a private homeowner's electrical panel. She didn't answer, just wished me a lovely afternoon and drove off, gravel spitting from her tires as she went. That night I called Ridgeline's dispatch out of habit, not urgency, and asked them to note any service requests tied to my address. The dispatcher, a woman named Patty who'd worked for Tom, promised to flag anything unusual and call me first. I told myself I was being paranoid. Debbie was petty, controlling, exhausting, but stealing power seemed like a strange hill to build a war on. I had no idea yet how far she was willing to go to win this one. The Ortegas mentioned at the mailbox cluster that Debbie had asked them, very casually, whether their cabin's electric meter was original equipment. They thought it was a maintenance question. I thought about her notebook and started paying much closer attention. It started with a knock at 7 in the morning. I opened the door to find Debbie flanked by 2 board members, arms crossed, looking like she'd rehearsed her opening line in the car on the way over here. "We've had a complaint," she announced, "about unauthorized power usage at this address." I laughed before I could stop myself. "Unauthorized by whom?" "Debbie," she held up her clipboard like a badge. "The HOA takes utility theft very seriously." She claimed a neighbor reported a suspicious line running from my shed toward the property boundary, allegedly siphoning power meant for common areas. I asked which neighbor. Potential. Protecting the whistleblower from retaliation. Apparently. I invited all 3 of them to look at my breaker box themselves, since Debbie clearly already knew where it was. She hesitated, glanced at the other board members, then declined, saying HOA representatives weren't authorized to inspect private electrical systems. "Then what exactly are you accusing me of?" I asked, arms crossed on my own porch. Debbie's smile tightened. "I'm not accusing, Emily. I'm documenting a pattern of concern." Pattern of concern was Debbie speak for "I have decided you're guilty." Later that day my porch light flickered twice and died. I checked the breaker box and found the main feed disconnected at the pole. Not inside my panel. Disconnected exactly where only a utility worker, or someone pretending to be one, could reach. I called Ridgeline directly instead of the emergency line. Patty pulled up the account and found a service order filed that morning under my address, requesting disconnection for suspected unauthorized tap, submitted by someone claiming to represent the property owner. "Who submitted it?" I asked, already knowing the shape of the answer. Patty read the name off the screen slowly. Deborah Whitfield, HOA board president. I stood in my dark kitchen and started, for the first time, to feel genuinely angry. Impersonating a property owner to request a disconnection wasn't a clipboard violation. It was fraud against a utility company, and Debbie had just committed it against a company she had absolutely no idea I controlled from the inside. I told Patty to restore my service quietly and flag the account. No explanations yet. No reveal. I wanted to see exactly how far Debbie intended to take this before I showed her what she'd actually stepped in. Power came back within the hour. Silent and unremarked. The way Ridgeline always handled things for people Tom had cared about. Debbie, watching from her porch with binoculars I later learned about, must have assumed the outage was simply a fluke. The next morning she posted in the community group chat about concerning irregularities at cabin 14, without naming me directly. Though everyone in the hollow knew exactly whose cabin sat at number 14 since I'd lived there for 6 years. Ruth called me immediately, furious on my behalf. She's trying to build a paper trail. Honey. Fines. Complaints. A fake theft report. She's setting you up for something bigger. I thanked her and asked her to keep her eyes open too. I drafted a calm, factual email to the board disputing the accusation and requesting the source of the original complaint in writing. Debbie replied within minutes, insisting board policy protected anonymous reporters. A policy that, as far as I could find, didn't exist. Chad showed up at my door that weekend, all charm and rehearsed sympathy. Mom can be intense, but honestly, Emily, wouldn't it just be easier to sell? I'll make it fair. I closed the door before he finished his sentence. That night someone left a printed notice taped to my shed. Notice of suspected utility theft. HOA review pending. No signature. No letterhead. Just Debbie's unmistakable font choices and her habit of overusing bold text for emphasis. I photographed the notice, dated it, and added it to a growing folder on my laptop labeled simply evidence. Tom had taught me that patient documentation beat angry confrontation every single time, and I intended to prove him right one more time. At the next HOA meeting, Debbie brought up utility theft concerns as a formal agenda item, glancing my way as she spoke to a packed room. I sat quietly, hands folded, letting her build a case she had no idea would collapse. We may need to involve local authorities, she announced gravely, to protect the integrity of our shared infrastructure. A few neighbors nodded along, unaware she was describing infrastructure she had personally sabotaged herself 2 days earlier without a single permit. I raised my hand and asked, sweetly, whether the board had contacted the actual power company to verify any of these claims before threatening a neighbor with police involvement. Debbie's jaw tightened. That's not necessary at this stage, she said. I smiled and said nothing more, letting the silence sit heavy in the room. Debbie moved on to the next agenda item too quickly, and I could see, just for a second, a flicker of something like doubt cross her face. 2 weeks passed with an uneasy quiet, fines piling up, notices taped and retaped to my shed, each one a little more aggressive than the last. Debbie was clearly building toward something, and I decided it was time to prepare properly. I met with Ridgeline's compliance officer, a careful man named Frank, and walked him through everything. The fraudulent disconnection request, the notes, the notebook Debbie had been sketching in near my equipment. He started a formal internal file that afternoon. Frank pulled service records for the entire hollow and found something odd. Debbie's own account, registered under a shell entity called Whitfield Ridge Holdings, was 73 days past due, dangerously close to the disconnection threshold she'd tried to trigger on me. I sat with that fact for a long moment. The woman accusing me of stealing power hadn't paid her own bill in over 2 months and was hiding the account behind a company name so the HOA wouldn't see it. Meanwhile, Chad escalated his offers, now including a relocation bonus if I signed by the end of the month. I told him, politely, that no amount of bonus money would make me forget his mother had tried to have me arrested for theft. Debbie began recruiting allies on the board, hosting private dinners where she framed me as difficult, secretive, someone who wouldn't cooperate with reasonable oversight. 2 board members who'd once been friendly started avoiding eye contact with me at the mailboxes. Ruth reported that Debbie had asked around about my job, my income, anything that would explain how I afforded my property taxes without an obvious visible career. "She thinks you're hiding something illegal," Ruth said, half laughing, half worried for me. I let her think it. I'd give her one worth solving, right up until the moment it stopped being fun for her and started being a legal problem she couldn't clipboard her way out of. One evening my outdoor camera caught Debbie's silhouette near my shed again, this time with a pair of bolt cutters resting against her leg while she photographed the meter. I forwarded the footage straight to Frank without comment, letting the file speak for itself. Frank called back within the hour, tension in his voice. "That's tampering with utility equipment, Emily. If she cuts anything, we're talking real criminal charges, not HOA drama." I told him to keep documenting everything and to wait for my signal. I wasn't protecting Debbie by waiting. I was protecting the reveal. Because the moment Ridgeline stepped in officially, everyone in the hollow would learn exactly who owned the lines Debbie had spent a year threatening to cut off from me. The board sent an official letter next, citing repeated non-cooperation regarding utility compliance and scheduling a final hearing before what they called possible legal escalation. I read it twice, then called my attorney, a calm woman named Priya who'd handled Ridgeline's contracts for years. Priya laughed when I described the letter. "They're accusing you of the exact thing their president is doing to her own account. Bring documentation. Bring me." Out to go very differently than Debbie expects it to. Chad tried once more, showing up unannounced with a bouquet of grocery store flowers, apologizing for his mother's intensity while still pushing the sale. I finally told him plainly, nothing was for sale, and his mother was about to learn a very expensive lesson. He blinked, confused by my confidence, clearly expecting fear instead. I closed the door gently this time. No slam, no drama, just the quiet certainty of someone who already knew exactly how this story was going to end. The Ortegas reached out privately, worried Debbie would target them next once she finished with me. I told them to keep records of everything, dates, screenshots, notices, and promised whatever happened at the hearing would protect them too. Debbie posted a triumphant update in the community chat, hinting that Cabin 14's situation would be fully resolved at the upcoming meeting. Neighbors speculated in the comments, some sympathetic to me, others already convinced by months of her careful narrative. I stopped reading the chat after that. Tom used to say arguing with a crowd only feeds the fire. Better to walk in with the truth and let the fire burn itself out on its own once the facts arrived. Frank sent over the finalized compliance file 3 days before the hearing. The fraudulent disconnection request, the bolt cutter footage, the overdue Whitfield Ridge Holdings account, and Debbie's notebook sketches, subpoenaed from her own board meeting minutes archive. Priya reviewed everything and nodded slowly. This isn't a squabble anymore, Emily. This is fraud, attempted tampering, and abuse of position. The hearing's going to be a formality. The real conversation happens after, with lawyers on both sides. I spent the night before the hearing on my porch, the same swing Tom built, listening to the creak, feeling strangely calm. I wasn't angry anymore, just ready, the way you feel before flipping a light switch you already know works. Ruth called that night too, voice trembling with excitement rather than fear. Whatever you're planning, honey, I hope Debbie feels it in her bones. That woman has terrorized this hollow long enough. It's someone else's turn to hold the power now. I didn't correct her choice of words. Felt fitting, actually, considering what I was about to reveal. Somewhere across the hollow, Debbie was probably rehearsing her closing argument, utterly unaware of the folder sitting quietly in my bag. Morning of the hearing, I dressed simply, the way I always did. Jeans and a flannel Tom used to wear on cold mornings. Priya met me in the parking lot with her briefcase and a look that said she'd been waiting years for a case like this. The community hall filled fast. More people than usual, drawn by Debbie's promise of a dramatic resolution. She stood at the front table, crisp blazer, folder squared perfectly, radiating the confidence of a woman who had never once lost a hearing here. We're gathered, she began, to address serious concerns regarding utility theft at Cabin 14. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I sat perfectly still beside Priya, letting Debbie build her case exactly as high as she wanted before it fell. She projected photos of my breaker box, timestamps circled in red marker, describing irregular tampering patterns she claimed proved deliberate theft. It was, I noted quietly, the exact box she herself had been photographed sabotaging weeks earlier on camera. Given the severity, Debbie continued, the board recommends immediate legal referral and formal HOA sanctions. She looked at me expectantly, waiting for panic, apology, anything resembling surrender. Instead, I simply raised my hand and asked to speak. Before we go further, I said calmly, I'd like the board to know I contacted Ridgeline Power and Light directly regarding these accusations. Debbie's confident smile flickered, just barely, the first crack appearing in a wall she'd built for months. They were very helpful, I continued, opening my folder, especially since I sit on their board and have full access to every account and service request tied to this hollow, including yours, Debbie. The room went completely, utterly silent. Debbie's face drained of color so fast that even Chad, standing near the back, took an involuntary step forward, as if he could somehow catch whatever was about to happen to his mother before it landed. For a long moment nobody spoke. Debbie opened her mouth twice and closed it again, her clipboard sliding slightly in her grip. I let the silence stretch, watching a year of accumulated fear evaporate off my own shoulders at last. That's not possible, she finally said, voice thinner than before. You live in a cabin. I almost laughed. Tom built this company from nothing, Debbie. We never needed to prove it to anyone up here. The board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that suggested some of them were rapidly recalculating every favor they'd granted Debbie over the years. Priya remained perfectly composed, waiting for her moment with the patience of someone who'd done this before. I'd like the board to see something, I said, nodding to Priya, who stood and opened her own folder without ceremony. Letting the facts do the talking, Debbie had spent months avoiding herself. This is a fraudulent service disconnection request, Priya announced. Filed under Emily's name by Deborah Whitfield, requesting termination of power to a residence she does not own. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Sharp and immediate. This, Priya continued, holding up another page, is security footage of MS. Whitfield approaching the same equipment with bolt cutters. She didn't play the video yet. Just let the description hang there, heavy and undeniable in the quiet room. Debbie's hands trembled slightly around her clipboard. I was documenting a hazard, she stammered. That's part of my duties. Priya raised an eyebrow. Board duties don't typically include impersonating homeowners to a public utility company. MS. Whitfield. And this, Priya added, sliding a final page across the table, is an account statement for Whitfield Ridge Holdings. 73 days past due. Registered to your home address. Currently facing disconnection under the very policy you tried to weaponize. The room erupted into hushed, disbelieving whispers. Neighbors who'd once nodded along with Debbie's accusations now stared at her with something between shock and quiet satisfaction. The way people look when a story finally makes sense at last. That account is unrelated, Debbie snapped, but her voice cracked halfway through the sentence, betraying the panic she was working so hard to hide behind 11 years of practiced authority in this exact room. Chad stepped forward suddenly, face pale. Mom, is that true? She didn't answer him. In that silence, I realized this wasn't only about me anymore. It was about a son learning who his mother really was. In real time, in public. I watched something shift in the crowd. Sympathy sliding quietly away from Debbie and toward the exhausted homeowners she'd find. Threatened and cornered for years. Ruth caught my eye from the second row and mouthed. Finally, the board chair, visibly rattled, called for a short recess. Debbie gathered her folder with shaking hands and walked stiffly toward the exit. Chad trailing behind her, both of them refusing to meet anyone's eyes on the way out. The recess lasted 20 minutes, but nobody left the hall. Neighbors clustered in small groups, trading stories they'd been too afraid to share before, fines they'd paid quietly, visits they'd never reported, warnings they'd swallowed to avoid Debbie's wrath. Ruth found me by the water table, gripping my arm tightly. You've been sitting on this the whole time? I nodded. I wanted the truth to land where it mattered, in front of everyone she'd threatened, not in a private phone call. When the meeting resumed, Debbie sat rigid at the front table, no longer at the podium, stripped of the confidence that had carried her through years of unchecked authority. The board chair cleared his throat and asked her directly to respond. I was protecting the community's interests, she said. Voice flat now, all performance drained out of it. Emily's situation seemed suspicious. I acted on a hunch, Priya interjected calmly. A hunch doesn't authorize fraud. MS. Whitfield, one board member, a quiet man named Harold who rarely spoke, finally raised his hand. How many other hunches have led to fines this year? Debbie didn't answer. Someone in the back muttered, Ask about the Delaney's, loud enough to carry. The mention of the Delaney's rippled through the room. Several longtime residents nodded grimly. remembering the young family Debbie had pressured out 2 years earlier under eerily similar accusations, right before Chad's first resort proposal quietly appeared on the agenda. I hadn't planned to bring up the Delaney's myself, but the pattern was suddenly undeniable to everyone watching. Debbie's campaign against me wasn't an isolated grudge. It was a strategy, repeated, refined, and aimed at anyone standing between Chad and his lots. Priya seized the opening. Independent audit of all HOA fines and utility complaints filed under Ms. Whitfield's tenure. The board chair, sweating now, agreed without hesitation, eager to distance himself from what was unfolding. Debbie stood abruptly. She said, voice rising for the first time. I have served this community for 11 years. Nobody applauded. The silence that answered her was louder than anything she could have said herself. Chad tried to speak on her behalf, insisting the accusations were taken out of context, but his voice lacked its usual salesman polish. Even he seemed to sense the ground shifting beneath the story his mother had built for so long. I finally stood myself. Folder closed. Voice steady. I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm here because someone tried to cut power to my home based on a lie and impersonated me to a company I happen to run. I'd like the board to formally dismiss the theft allegation, I continued, and open a real investigation into the pattern of fines and pressure applied to homeowners who declined to sell to Whitfield family interests. The room murmured agreement. The board chair nodded, visibly relieved to have a clear path forward. Motion to dismiss the allegation against Cabin 14 and initiate a full audit, he said. Passed unanimously, even the members who'd once sided quietly with Debbie. Debbie sat frozen through the vote, staring at her own folder like it might rearrange itself into a different outcome if she looked hard enough. Chad placed a hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off, still staring straight ahead. As people began filing out, several neighbors approached me quietly, thanking me, sharing their own stories of fines and pressure they'd endured in silence for years, afraid to be Debbie's next target without proof or backup like mine. Ruth squeezed my hand on the way out. Tom would be proud of you tonight, she said. I thought about the porch swing, the quiet years, the folder I'd carried impatiently, and felt, for the first time in months, entirely at peace. That should have been the end of it. A clean, satisfying close to a long, exhausting fight. But Debbie Whitfield had run this hollow for 11 years by never simply accepting defeat. And that night proved to be no different. 2 days later, Frank called with unsettling news. Someone had attempted to access Ridgeline's internal service portal using outdated employee credentials tied to a contractor who'd left the company years earlier, right around the time Tom first hired him. The login attempt traced back to an IP address registered to Whitfield Ridge Holdings. Debbie, apparently, wasn't done fighting quietly. She was now trying to dig into the company itself, searching for leverage, ammunition, anything to reverse her public humiliation. I sat with that information for a long time, unsettled less by the attempt itself and more by what it revealed, that Debbie's need for control ran deeper than clipboards and community meetings. She wasn't backing down. She was escalating. Priya advised filing a formal complaint immediately, given unauthorized access attempts to protected utility systems carried serious legal weight far beyond anything HOA policy could address. I agreed, though part of me hoped it wouldn't need to go that far. Meanwhile, Whispers spread through the hollow that Debbie's HOA presidency was in jeopardy. An emergency board vote scheduled to address her continued role given the mounting audit findings and the unauthorized access attempt now under formal review. Chad started avoiding the community entirely, his resort pitch quietly disappearing from the agenda. Investors reportedly pulling back once word of fraud allegations against his mother reached them. His 9 acquired lots suddenly looked like a liability instead of an opportunity. Debbie, cornered on every side, grew erratic. She left a long, rambling voicemail on my phone one night, alternating between accusations and thinly veiled threats, insisting I'd made an enemy I would regret making before the year was over. I saved the voicemail immediately and sent it straight to Priya, who added it to the growing file without comment. Though her expression suggested Debbie was making her own case worse with every unhinged word she left behind on record. The audit results arrived a week later, more damning than anyone expected. 17 separate fines issued to owners who declined Chad's offers for fraudulent disconnection requests beyond mine, and thousands in dues quietly funneled through Whitfield Ridge Holdings. The board scheduled an emergency vote to remove Debbie as president, effective immediately, pending further investigation. She didn't attend. Who read a brief statement about misunderstandings that convinced absolutely nobody left in that room. The vote passed unanimously, 11 years of authority ending not with a dramatic showdown but with an empty chair and a son too embarrassed to look anyone in the eye while reading his mother's excuses off a folded index card. I felt no triumph watching it happen, only a quiet, settled relief, the same feeling of finally exhaling after holding your breath for months without realizing how tightly you'd been clenched the entire time around it. Ruth hosted an impromptu gathering on her porch that evening. Neighbors bringing casseroles and lawn chairs, trading stories freely now that fear no longer sat over every conversation about the HOA like a low, constant fog. I sat among them, finally just Emily from Cabin 14 again, no longer under investigation, no longer defending a folder full of evidence. For the first time in months, I let myself actually enjoy the sound of the creek nearby. But peace in the hollow, I was learning, rarely lasted long without one final complication. And Debbie Whitfield wasn't finished yet. Not by a long stretch. Not while she still believed she could somehow claw her way back to control. 3 weeks after the vote, Debbie filed a lawsuit against the HOA board, claiming wrongful termination of her position and defamation tied to the audit's public findings, seeking damages that seemed designed more to punish than to actually win. Priya wasn't worried. She told me over coffee. This isn't a real case. It's a message. She wants everyone to know she's not going quietly. I nodded, unsurprised, already bracing for whatever came next from that direction. Debbie began appearing at community events uninvited, standing at the edges, watching, saying little, her presence alone enough to unsettle people who'd finally started relaxing after months of tension hanging over every gathering in the hollow. Chad, meanwhile, quietly listed his 9 lots for sale, cutting his losses on the resort dream entirely. Word spread that investors had walked the moment fraud allegations touched the project, unwilling to risk their names near the Whitfield story. I ran into Chad once at the general store, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Finally he said, quietly, I didn't know how far she'd go. I believed him, mostly, though I no longer felt obligated to comfort him about it. Debbie's lawsuit hit its first snag quickly. Priya's countersuit citing the fraudulent disconnection request, the bolt cutter footage, and the unauthorized access attempt, transforming Debbie's defamation claim into a far more dangerous conversation about her own legal exposure instead. A local news outlet picked up the story, drawn by the unusual detail of an HOA president secretly accused of tampering with utility equipment against a homeowner who happened to sit on that very utilities board without anyone realizing it. I declined most interview requests, wanting the Hollow's piece back more than any spotlight, though Priya handled one brief statement confirming the facts already established at the hearing, careful and measured, giving reporters nothing extra to sensationalize. Debbie, by contrast, gave a rambling interview to a small local paper, insisting she'd been targeted by a wealthy newcomer with hidden motives, a framing that fooled almost nobody who actually lived in the Hollow and had watched things unfold. The article ran anyway, and for a few days strangers online speculated wildly about my life, my company, my motives, most of it wrong, some of it almost funny in how far removed it was from the quiet reality of my cabin. Ruth found the whole spectacle delightful. "Let her talk," she said, laughing over the fence one morning. "The more she talks, the more people remember exactly who she really is underneath all that clipboard authority she used to carry around." I started noticing something shift in the Hollow itself. A lightness returning to gatherings. Neighbors greeting each other without glancing nervously toward Debbie's old porch first. The way people finally breathe once a long, quiet storm has clearly passed through. The Ortegas thanked me again at a community potluck, admitting they'd nearly sold to Chad out of sheer exhaustion before the hearing happened. "We would have lost this place for nothing," the wife said, voice thick with relief. I told her the truth plainly. It wasn't really about me winning. It was about refusing to let fear decide who got to keep their home. A decision I'd made the moment I found Debbie's bolt cutters on my camera footage. Still, something in Debbie's demeanor at the store, at the mailbox, in passing on the road, told me she hadn't actually accepted defeat yet, only paused, recalculating, the way dangerous people do right before their final, desperate move. The lawsuit against the board quietly collapsed under Priya's countersuit. But Debbie, rather than retreating, seemed to interpret the loss as confirmation that subtler tactics had failed and something bolder was now required to reclaim what she'd lost. Late one night my security camera caught her again. Alone this time, standing near the main transformer feeding half the Hollow. Not just my cabin, studying it with an intensity that made my stomach tighten the moment I saw the footage. I called Frank immediately, heart pounding. "She's not just targeting me anymore," I said. "That transformer serves the whole subdivision." He promised to dispatch a technician quietly at dawn, and to flag the footage for law enforcement without delay. I barely slept that night, replaying the footage, Debbie's silhouette illuminated only by her phone flashlight, moving with the deliberate care of someone who'd clearly researched exactly which equipment mattered most before deciding where to aim her anger. At dawn, the technician found scorch marks near an access panel, evidence someone had attempted, unsuccessfully, to force it open. Whatever tool Debbie had used had failed against Ridgeline's newer tamper-resistant locks, installed years ago as routine safety upgrades. Had she succeeded, Frank explained grimly, the resulting outage could have knocked out power to over 40 homes, including elderly residents dependent on medical equipment. An act that crossed from petty vengeance into something genuinely, dangerously reckless. I brought the footage straight to the sheriff's department myself this time, No more quiet handling. No more patience. Attempted sabotage of shared utility infrastructure wasn't a homeowner's dispute anymore. It was a public safety matter requiring real intervention. Deputy Ramirez, reviewing the footage, recognized the transformer location immediately. That's the one near the Hendersons' place. Mrs. On oxygen. His expression hardened. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is attempted criminal tampering with essential infrastructure. Word spread through the hollow fast this time. Faster than any HOA newsletter ever managed. Neighbors who'd once merely disliked Debbie now looked genuinely frightened, realizing how close her escalating obsession had actually come to endangering vulnerable people among them. Ruth, uncharacteristically shaken, called me that evening. She could have hurt Margaret Henderson, she said quietly. Actually hurt her, I agreed, unable to find any words that adequately captured how far Debbie had drifted from mere petty control by that point. Deputies visited Debbie's home the next morning with a search warrant. The footage and scorch mark evidence enough to justify it. Neighbors watched from porches as cruisers lined her driveway. A stark, undeniable image replacing months of whispered rumors at last. Chad arrived partway through, pale and shaking, standing helplessly on the lawn as officers carried out bolt cutters, notebooks, and a laptop later found to contain detailed notes on Ridgeline's grid layout across the entire Hollow subdivision. The notes revealed something worse than impulsive anger. Careful planning, dates, times, which transformer served which homes, clearly building toward something far more calculated than a single reckless night near the access panel my camera had caught. Priya reviewed the warrant details with a grim expression I hadn't seen from her before. This isn't harassment anymore, Emily. This is premeditated sabotage of critical infrastructure. She was planning to escalate again and again, until something actually happened. I thought of Margaret Henderson's oxygen machine, of the Ortegas newborn upstairs in their cabin, of every quiet family who trusted the lights to simply stay on, and felt something harden in me that no amount of HOA fines had ever managed to before. Debbie was arrested that afternoon. Charges pending. Released later on bail with conditions barring her from Ridgeline property and requiring a mental health evaluation. A detail that spread through the Hollow with a mixture of shock and grim understanding. Chad, reeling, finally spoke to me honestly for the first time since this had all begun. I thought it was about money, he said, voice breaking. I didn't know it had become about something else for her entirely. I didn't have an easy answer for him. Some people, I was learning, couldn't separate losing control from losing everything. And Debbie had apparently decided that endangering her own neighbors was preferable to simply accepting she'd already lost. The Hollow held an emergency meeting, this time led entirely by Harold, the quiet board member who'd asked the first hard question at my hearing weeks earlier. He proposed immediate bylaw reforms preventing any single person from wielding unchecked authority again. I attended, mostly to listen, watching neighbors speak openly for the first time in years about fear they'd carried silently under Debbie's reign. Fines they'd never contested. Complaints they'd swallowed rather than risk becoming her next public target. Margaret Henderson herself attended, oxygen tank in tow, and thanked me directly in front of everyone, voice trembling. You caught it before it reached us, she said. I told her the credit belonged to a camera and a careful technician. Mostly. Ruth squeezed my arm afterward. Credit belongs to you too. Honey, For not letting this go the first time she lied about you stealing power that was never stolen at all. I let myself accept that, finally, without deflecting it. Debbie's court date was set for late autumn. Charges including attempted tampering with utility infrastructure, unauthorized computer access, and fraud, each carrying consequences far heavier than any fine she'd ever issued from behind her old clipboard. Chad quietly sold his remaining lots at a loss, the resort dream fully abandoned, and moved out of the hollow entirely, unable, he told Ruth once, to face neighbors who now associated his family name with scorch marks near the Hendersons' porch. I found myself, strangely, feeling something close to sympathy for him, a son caught in his mother's collapsing ambition. Though sympathy didn't erase the months of pressure he'd personally applied trying to force me out of Tom's cabin. The transformer received permanent reinforced housing within the week, Frank overseeing the upgrade personally, muttering that he never wanted another HOA president within 50 feet of exposed infrastructure again for as long as he worked at Ridgeline. I finally told the Hollow, openly this time, exactly who I was and what Ridgeline meant to me, not as a reveal for leverage anymore, just as an honest answer to the quiet questions people had clearly been holding back. Tom built this from nothing because he believed people up here deserved reliable power without games, I said at that meeting. I kept it quiet because I wanted a quiet life. I didn't expect to need it as a shield. The room absorbed that without judgment. Mostly relief. A community exhausted by secrecy of its own kind finally exhaling around one honest explanation instead of another rumor spreading through group chats and porch conversations for weeks afterward. Harold's bylaw reforms passed easily. Term limits, mandatory audits, an independent complaint review process no single board member could quietly bury the way Debbie had buried the Delaney situation years earlier without anyone noticing at the time. Ruth was elected interim president by near-unanimous vote days later, a choice that made most of the Hollow visibly relax. Trading 11 years of fear for a woman known mostly for her garden and her blunt, reliable honesty, I stayed out of leadership myself, content to simply be Emily from Cabin 14 again. Though I did agree to serve on an advisory committee ensuring Ridgeline and the HOA communicated properly going forward, avoiding another Debbie situation entirely. Autumn settled over the Hollow gently that year. Porches full of pumpkins instead of fine notices. Neighbors waving freely instead of glancing nervously toward a house that had once controlled far more than it should have ever been allowed to. Margaret Henderson sent me a jar of homemade preserves with a note that simply read, "Thank you for the lights staying on." I kept the jar on my counter longer than I probably should have, unable to bring myself to open it. Even the camera footage, once a source of dread every time it caught motion near my shed, became something almost mundane again. Deer wandering past at dawn. Ruth's cat cutting through the yard. Ordinary life resuming its ordinary rhythm. I thought the story was finally, truly over. The danger fully contained. The community healed enough to move forward. I didn't yet know Debbie's court case would surface one more twist neither of us had seen coming. Priya called 2 weeks before the trial with news that shifted everything again. Investigators reviewing Debbie's financial records had uncovered something far larger than overdue utility bills, a pattern of embezzled HOA dues stretching back nearly 6 years. Nearly $200,000. Funneled slowly through Whitfield Ridge Holdings, disguised as landscaping contracts, security upgrades, and community improvement projects that, upon inspection, had simply never actually happened anywhere in the Hollow at all. I sat with that number for a long time, thinking of every fine I'd paid, every neighbor who'd tightened their budget to cover rising dues, all while Debbie quietly redirected shared community money toward funding her son's development ambitions. Harold, reviewing the findings as interim board member, looked physically ill. "The new pool deck we voted on 3 years ago," he said slowly. "It never got built. Nothing at all." Word spread through the hollow with a different energy this time. Not shock exactly, more like exhausted confirmation. The final missing piece explaining years of unexplained shortfalls neighbors had quietly wondered about without ever having proof to point toward. Ruth called an emergency community meeting to walk residents through the findings transparently, determined that whatever happened next would happen in daylight, not behind closed doors the way so much of Debbie's tenure had operated for over a decade. I watched neighbors process real anger for the first time. Not at me, not at each other, but squarely at the woman who'd spent years positioning herself as their protector while quietly siphoning away the very dues meant to protect them. Chad, contacted by investigators regarding his knowledge of the embezzlement, cooperated fully, providing records that ultimately strengthened the case against his own mother. A decision Ruth later told me had visibly aged him 10 years in a single week. "I didn't know about the money," he told me once, quietly, at the general store. The resort, the pressure, that was bad enough. I didn't know she was stealing from people to fund it. I believed him this time completely. Priya explained that the embezzlement charges alone carried significant prison exposure, layered now atop the tampering, fraud, and unauthorized access counts already pending, transforming Debbie's case from a local scandal into a genuinely serious criminal matter facing real consequences. I felt no satisfaction hearing it, only a tired, hollow kind of clarity, the sense of finally understanding the full shape of something I'd only glimpsed in pieces. A clipboard and a smile hiding something far uglier underneath the whole time. The hollow's finances, once mysteriously thin despite steadily rising dues, suddenly made sense entirely. Every unrepaired fence, every postponed road maintenance project, every excuse Debbie had offered over the years now revealed as deliberate misdirection instead of oversight. Harold began the slow work of financial recovery, coordinating with the county and Ridgeline's own legal team, since several embezzled funds had been laundered through fake utility maintenance invoices submitted directly to Ridgeline under false pretenses years earlier. Frank discovered those fraudulent invoices himself, buried in old records. Debbie's signature on paperwork requesting emergency line repairs that Ridgeline crews had never actually been dispatched to perform anywhere near the hollow during those specific dates at all. "She used our own paperwork to steal from her neighbors," Frank said, shaking his head. "Cited threats to steal from you directly, and defrauded the company that would have caught her the moment anyone actually looked closely at the records." I thought about how close it had come to working, how easily her authority, confidence, and clipboard had shielded years of quiet theft, until one attempted sabotage near a transformer finally cracked the surface wide enough for the truth beneath to surface. The trial date moved up given the new charges. Prosecutors eager to consolidate everything into a single comprehensive case rather than dragging the hollow through multiple separate proceedings spread out across an already exhausting year for everyone involved. Ruth organized a fund to help residents recover losses tied to the embezzlement. Neighbors who'd never expected to need it pitching in anyway. A small, quiet act of community solidarity that felt like the hollow finally healing itself from within. I contributed anonymously, wanting the gesture to belong to the hollow itself rather than to Ridgeline or to me personally. Though Ruth, sharp as ever, guessed correctly within a week and simply squeezed my hand without saying anything about it. Debbie, out on bail, grew increasingly isolated. Former allies distancing themselves as the embezzlement details spread. The community she'd once controlled through fear now largely united against her in a way 11 years of clipboards had never managed to achieve. I saw her once more before the trial. At the county courthouse steps. Thinner, quieter, none of the sharp authority that had once filled every room she entered. For a moment, briefly, I almost felt something close to pity. She caught my eye and looked away quickly. No accusations left. No clipboard. Nothing but the tired weight of someone finally facing the full consequences of choices made over years of believing herself untouchable within her small mountain kingdom. Chad approached me separately that same afternoon, apologizing again, more genuinely this time. "I'm selling the last of my lots to the HOA directly," he said. "Cheap. Decent thing left I could actually do." I told him that was a good start. Nothing more. Nothing less. Unwilling to offer forgiveness that wasn't fully mine to give on behalf of every neighbor his family had pressured, fined, and frightened across 2 exhausting, difficult years. The Hollow, meanwhile, began quiet preparations for the trial's outcome regardless of the verdict. Harold drafting new financial safeguards. Ruth coordinating community rebuilding efforts. A collective determination that whatever happened in that courtroom, the Hollow itself would move forward stronger. I spent my evenings on the porch swing more often that season, watching the creek, feeling the particular kind of tired that comes after a long fight finally nearing its true end. One built on patience rather than anger. Margaret Henderson invited me to dinner one evening, insisting on properly thanking me away from cameras and community meetings. Over her kitchen table, she told me quietly that Debbie had fined her twice for her oxygen equipment's exterior tubing placement. "I never told anyone," Margaret admitted. "I was embarrassed and scared she'd find another reason to make things harder." I realized then how many quiet stories like hers existed across the Hollow, buried under years of fear nobody had felt safe voicing. That realization settled something firmly in me. This had never really been about power lines or clipboards at all. It had always been about people finally feeling safe enough to speak honestly again, without fear of quiet, disproportionate retaliation. The trial began on a cold Tuesday morning. Courtroom packed with familiar faces from the Hollow. Ruth beside me, Harold 2 rows back, Margaret near the front despite the long drive her condition made difficult for her to manage. Debbie sat beside her attorney, smaller somehow than I remembered. None of the commanding presence that had once filled community meetings with quiet dread among neighbors too tired to keep fighting her authority year after year. The prosecution opened methodically, laying out the fraudulent disconnection request first. My case the clean, simple entry point into a far larger pattern the jury would spend the coming days untangling piece by devastating piece. Frank testified about the bolt cutter footage, the transformer sabotage attempt, and the fraudulent utility invoices. His measured, technical explanations landing heavier in the courtroom than any emotional appeal could have managed on its own that morning. I testified next, walking the jury through the fines, the notices, the fraudulent theft accusation, and finally the reveal at the hearing that had cracked Debbie's carefully constructed authority wide open in front of the entire community at once. 2:14. When asked why I'd waited to reveal my connection to Ridgeline, I explained simply, I wanted the truth to matter more than my company. I wanted people to see what she'd actually done, not just who I happened to be. The defense attempted to frame Debbie's actions as overzealous community stewardship, a woman who'd simply gone too far protecting the Hollow's interests. The argument landed poorly against scorch marks on a transformer serving a home with medical equipment inside. Margaret Henderson testified about her finds, her oxygen tubing, the quiet fear she'd carried for years, her steady, dignified voice doing more to sway the jury than any technical evidence presented across the entire trial up to that point. Chad testified reluctantly, confirming he'd known about the pressure campaign against holdout homeowners, but hadn't known about the embezzlement until investigators approached him directly. His visible discomfort on the stand reading as genuine rather than performed to the jury. Debbie herself took the stand late in the trial, attempting one final version of her story, insisting everything had been misunderstood, exaggerated, taken out of context by neighbors who'd simply never appreciated everything she'd sacrificed running the Hollow for over a decade. Under cross-examination, the prosecution walked her through the fraudulent invoices line by line, her explanations growing thinner and more contradictory with each document presented until even her own attorney's expression shifted toward quiet, resigned concern. "You submitted repair requests for work that was never performed," the prosecutor said flatly. "For years. Over fence heights and firewood stacks." Debbie had no real answer, only silence stretching uncomfortably across the courtroom. I watched the jury's faces during that silence. Watched years of quiet suffering finally translate into something undeniable, concrete, impossible to dismiss the way Debbie had once dismissed every complaint raised against her within Hollow meetings for over a decade. Closing arguments arrived quickly after that, the prosecution methodically tying every thread together. Fraud, tampering, embezzlement, unauthorized access, each charge building on the last into a portrait far larger than any single incident could have painted alone. The defense's closing felt small by comparison, asking the jury to consider Debbie's years of dedicated service, a phrase that landed strangely hollow given everything already laid bare across days of careful, methodical testimony from witness after witness. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. Ruth gripped my hand tightly in the hallway outside, both of us silent, watching Harold pace, watching Margaret rest quietly in a chair Chad had unexpectedly fetched for her without being asked. When the verdict came back, guilty on every count, the courtroom released a breath it seemed to have been holding collectively for the entire trial. A wave of quiet, exhausted relief moving through rows of neighbors who'd waited years for this moment. Debbie showed no reaction beyond a slow, small nod, as if some distant part of her had already accepted this outcome long before the jury foreperson finished reading the final charge aloud into the hushed, waiting courtroom. Sentencing was set for several weeks later, prosecutors indicating restitution alongside significant prison time given the scale of embezzlement and the genuine danger created by the attempted transformer sabotage near vulnerable, medically dependent residents of the Hollow. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered on the steps, not celebrating exactly, more relieved. The particular quiet joy of people finally allowed to exhale after holding tension for far longer than anyone should reasonably have to carry it alone. Ruth hugged me tightly, said. I nodded, though something in me understood the Hollow's healing was really just beginning, the trial only closing one chapter of a much longer, quieter recovery still ahead of everyone. Chad approached me one final time on those steps, quieter than I'd ever seen him. Thank you for not making this about revenge, he said. It could have been so much worse for everyone if you'd wanted it to be. I told him honestly that revenge had never interested me. Only the lights staying on and neighbors sleeping without fear of a knock at 7 in the morning demanding explanations for things they'd never actually done wrong at all. Sentencing day arrived cold and clear. The Hollow's familiar faces filling the courtroom once more. This time with a different energy. Closure rather than dread. The sense of a long, exhausting chapter finally reaching its true and final conclusion. The judge, reviewing the full scope of Debbie's actions, spoke plainly about the danger created by targeting essential infrastructure and the deep betrayal embedded in years of embezzling from the very community she'd sworn to protect and serve honestly. Debbie received a substantial prison sentence alongside a comprehensive restitution order, funds earmarked to rebuild the Hollow's depleted reserves and repair the years of deferred maintenance her theft had quietly caused across the entire community without anyone realizing it. She didn't look back as deputies led her from the courtroom, and for the first time in over a year, I felt the tension I'd been carrying since that first fraudulent disconnection notice finally, completely, genuinely release from my shoulders. Ruth exhaled beside me. 11 years, she murmured. 11 years of fear. And it ends with her walking out that side door without even looking at anyone she spent all that time terrorizing across this whole entire mountain community. Margaret Henderson squeezed my hand from her wheelchair. The lights stayed on, she said simply, echoing her own thank you note from months earlier. Felt, somehow, like the truest possible summary of everything we'd all just survived together. Outside, the Hollow's autumn air felt different somehow. Lighter, cleaner. The particular relief of a community finally released from a fear so constant it had become nearly invisible, woven quietly into every fence height and firewood stack decision for years. I drove home slowly that evening, past the transformer with its new reinforced housing, past the mailbox cluster where so many quiet threats had once arrived, past my own shed where this entire story had first begun months earlier. Chad's remaining lots transferred fully to the HOA within weeks, purchased below market value exactly as he'd promised. The funds folding directly into Harold's restoration plan for roads, common areas, and the pool deck that had never actually existed. Frank confirmed the fraudulent Ridgeline invoices were fully reversed, funds recovered where possible, and new internal safeguards installed preventing any single account, individual, or shell entity from manipulating service requests without multiple layers of verification going forward. Ruth's presidency settled into something the Hollow hadn't experienced in over a decade. Quiet, transparent, boring in the best possible way. Meetings ending on time. Fines rare and clearly justified. Neighbors greeting each other without lingering hesitation anymore. The Ortegas baby had her first birthday that autumn, and the whole Hollow showed up to celebrate together on the shared lawn. A gathering that would have been unthinkable during Debbie's tenure, when community events felt more like surveillance than celebration. I brought a cake Tom used to make, his old recipe, and found myself laughing freely for the first time in what felt like years, surrounded by neighbors who no longer flinched at the sight of a clipboard nearby. Margaret's preserves became a running joke between us, a new jar appearing on my porch every few weeks with increasingly elaborate notes attached, each one a small, sweet reminder of exactly why this entire fight had mattered so much. Chad moved away entirely by winter, starting over somewhere without his mother's name attached to every conversation. And though our history remained complicated, I found myself hoping, genuinely, that he'd build something honest wherever he landed next in life. Harold's bylaw reforms became a quiet model. Other HOAs in the region began requesting copies of term limits, transparent audits, protections against exactly the kind of unchecked authority that had let Debbie operate unquestioned for over a decade. I finally let myself simply be Emily from Cabin 14 again. No folder of evidence waiting on my laptop. No camera footage reviewed anxiously each morning. Just quiet mornings on Tom's porch swing, listening to the creek run steadily past. Ridgeline continued humming along in the background of my life exactly as it always had, powering homes across 3 counties, including every cabin in the hollow, without a single homeowner needing to know or care who quietly kept the lights on. Ruth and I fell into an easy rhythm. Coffee some mornings, garden advice she never actually needed but always offered anyway. The comfortable, unremarkable friendship of 2 women who'd survived something difficult together and come out closer for it. Occasionally a new resident would ask, curious, about the story behind Cabin 14 and the power company, and I'd tell it simply now, without drama, a cautionary tale about clipboards, control, and the quiet danger of unchecked authority left unquestioned too long. The Hollow's reserve fund slowly rebuilt itself over the following year. The pool deck finally, actually constructed this time, complete with a small plaque Harold insisted on adding, dedicated simply to transparency, and the neighbors who demanded it. I visited that plaque sometimes, running my fingers over the engraved words, thinking of Margaret's oxygen tubing, the Ortega's quiet fear, every neighbor who'd swallowed a complaint rather than risk becoming Debbie's next public target across those long, difficult years. Word occasionally reached us about Debbie, brief updates through mutual contacts, adjusting slowly to a life without clipboards, without authority, without the small mountain kingdom she'd once ruled through fear rather than the honest service she'd always claimed. I felt no need to seek those updates out myself, content instead with the quiet, steady rhythm of my own life. Tom's cabin, the creek, the porch swing, and a hollow finally allowed to simply exist without constant, quiet dread. Spring arrived again eventually, the hollow blooming the way it always had before Debbie's tenure, before the fines and fear and fraudulent accusations. A community remembering, slowly, what it actually felt like to simply be neighbors again together. I stood on my porch one clear morning, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise catch the transformer's new reinforced housing down the road. A small, sturdy reminder of everything the hollow had survived and rebuilt together since that first dark morning. Ruth waved from her yard. Margaret's dog barked somewhere nearby, and the Ortega's toddler laughed loudly from their porch. Ordinary sounds that had once felt impossible to imagine returning to this hollow after everything that had happened here. Tom would have loved this, I thought, this exact quiet morning, this exact community finally free to simply live without fear, powered honestly, governed transparently, protected not by silence but by neighbors finally willing to speak up together. The lights stayed on, the hollow healed, and somewhere down the mountain, the transformer hummed quietly and steadily, exactly as it always should have, powering a community that had finally, fully, taken its peace back for good. In the months that followed, the audit's full findings were formally shared with every resident, closing out old fears with hard numbers and clear accountability rather than lingering rumor and quiet suspicion that had shadowed the hollow for years. Restitution payments began arriving steadily, gradually restoring the community reserve fund Debbie had drained for years. funding the real pool deck, road repairs, and long overdue maintenance projects finally completed without a single fraudulent invoice attached anywhere. The Hollow's insurance rates even improved once inspectors confirmed the reinforced transformer housing and updated safety protocols ridgeline installed following the sabotage attempt. Quiet, practical benefit nobody had expected from such a painful, exhausting year. Chad sent one final letter that winter, brief and sincere, thanking the community for handling everything with more grace than his family had ever shown them. A small gesture that closed, at least for me, the last open thread of the story. Debbie's name slowly faded from daily conversation in the Hollow, mentioned occasionally in passing, mostly as a cautionary example new residents learned about once, then rarely needed reminding of again as trust steadily rebuilt itself across the community. Looking back, I never wanted to be the woman who owned the power company that saved her own home. I just wanted quiet mornings, Tom's porch swing, and neighbors who didn't fear a knock at the door. What I got instead was proof that patience, evidence, and quiet truth eventually outlast even the loudest, most determined abuse of power, especially when that power finally meets someone who refuses to simply hand over her home. The Hollow stands today exactly as Tom once imagined it. Honest, connected, and finally, truly at peace. Its lights burning steady every single night, powered quietly by the very company Karen never once suspected I owned.